Well, thank you so much, Ben, for joining me today. Very excited to talk about your incredible journey in your career so far and sort of what you're building now at Harmless Harvest and sort of the mission and vision of what you're doing with that brand. You know, a really interesting sector that has a lot of different innovations coming through it, a lot of foundational stuff that sort of still needs to be attended to properly. So before we get into all that, talk a little bit about your journey and your career path before Harmless Harvest.
Well, Grant, thanks for having me. I'd say, we all have, I guess, our own unique stories, and mine started in rural Wisconsin. I'm actually a first generation college student. Didn't even know at a young age that I wanted to go to college. I just was not exposed to those types of things. I had, chores to do, lived out in the country on an old farm. Each Saturday we would take our garbage to the dump and I would look for treasures. I got my first bike out of the dump. We fixed it up and, it was kind of, spray painted it, did all that type of stuff. So, it definitely was, a good, I would say a tougher, but a good upbringing. And I think what I took from that is I do now have this kind of eternal optimism and I have this incredible work ethic. Like I can roll up my sleeves and I'm comfortable in any environment, whether I'm composting, which I've had that job before, or, in a board meeting. I'm very comfortable at all different levels and all different types of situations. And I think that really has served me well. But I think, as we look back in life, there's always like these interesting inflection points. And I got my first real paying job, besides mowing lawn and babysitting, at a private golf and country club in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, which is a town of about 35,000. I lived outside of Fond du Lac, but, I got a job there as a busboy. And that's when I really got exposed to, wow, all these people who, belong to this country club, they're doctors, lawyers, business people and whatnot. And so that's when I realized, hey, I don't want to work at a factory or whatever. I'm going to go to college. And I think in the beginning, I kind of thought I wanted to be a lawyer. Maybe because I like to talk and I think in my head is like, litigation and just in the courtroom. But I think anybody who's in law recognizes that's probably the minority of what they do. But I applied and went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And that was an amazing experience for me. So, fast forward, my career, I went into consulting, management consulting on the East Coast, super quant-based analytical consulting firm. Actually took a leave of absence. Actually, my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, we quit our jobs to go do volunteer work in Central America, and they didn't let us quit. They convinced us to come back, but they paid for us to go down and take a sabbatical. And so we went to Costa Rica to begin with. We spent 3.5 months in Central America, worked on an organic coffee farm and lived with a family. We spent time, when we first got there, we lived separately with different families. So we'd learn Spanish faster. I speak German fluently, but Spanish, was very new to me. So I said all sorts of very fun, when you're learning a language, you say all sorts of stupid, funny things.
Oh, yeah.
More than my fair share of those. And then, went up to Guatemala, did more volunteer work. That was my I was in charge of composting on this organic farm. Did that, build some homes, spend some time, just trying to give back. It was one of our, we wanted to do more in communities and we wanted to learn some Spanish. Went back, worked for another 6 months and then, quit again and moved to the West Coast. I did brand strategy consulting. So I did more kind of macro level, helping companies launch, working with C-level executives. And there was another inflection point for me. So, I kind of assumed that C-level executives and CEOs in particular, like these were these uber crazy smart, kind of an echelon that, a simple guy like me could never aspire to. And what I learned in that job was, I have a lot to learn and I have work to do and I'm not ready yet at that time, but I have it in me like that I can do this. And so that was when I realized that, someday if I worked hard and, did a good job, that I too could be a CEO. And so that was an important inflection point. I went back to and got my MBA at Kellogg in Chicago. My wife, a fiance at this point, she works, she did AmeriCorps Vista, which is basically Peace Corps in America. We were Chicago. She worked on micro enterprise development for financially disadvantaged women. And then we moved to the East Coast. She went to Wharton, and I worked at Johnson & Johnson. I worked on a global launch. And then she interned at General Mills, wanted to go to General Mills. She had an offer to go to General Mills. They really wanted her, so they offered me a job as well. So I was part of that package deal.
Nice.
And that was my first real foray into food and beverage. Yeah. And I have, one of my mom's kind of side jobs, when I was younger, was she had a catering business. She's quite a good cook. My grandma's a very good cook. I would consider myself very comfortable in the kitchen. I'll let others judge whether I'm a good cook or not, but I'm very comfortable in the kitchen. And I love food and beverage. Like, I would consider myself somewhat of a foodie. And so I worked at General Mills. We both worked at General Mills for about 8 years. Had just a great experience. And that was where I really learned how to run a business. Mm-hmm. So in the marketing role, you're really a general manager, and you run the business cross-functionally. And there were I worked on shelf stable, I worked on refrigerated, I worked on frozen, I worked on innovation, established businesses, I worked on more customer assignments. I worked on kid products all the way to boomer type products. So kind of got the whole range of experience, and just I can't be thankful enough for my time at General Mills. I learned a lot, and every business I worked on there, I definitely developed a little bit of a reputation of just, I believed that at the end of the day, a basic covenant that, as food manufacturers you have with consumers is that you're doing right by them from a health and wellness standpoint. And so every business I worked on, I really worked to eliminate things that I felt were not in consumers' best interest. Well, whether it be high levels of sodium, eliminating artificial flavors, artificial colors, removing MSG, all those types of things silently in most cases. Mm-hmm. And just, because, a lot of the business I worked on, they're household names, you're reaching 30% of U.S. households in a year.
The scale is crazy.
Yeah. So if you can improve it incrementally, make it better and better, that's like one way of improving. And then certainly what we can do to eliminate waste and stuff like that, which is good for environment, but also good financially. And then fast forward, at that point, we then moved to California. My wife actually, again, led the move. She wanted to work for Cliff Bar. She had an offer from Cliff Bar. So we moved out here, and I followed her. We had 2 kids by this point, and I said that I would, take care of, wrapping up school year with the kids, selling the house, and do all that type of stuff while she, started her new job. And then we moved out here. I took a job with Plum Organics, and that was where then I could bring my full self to work. And now you're working on something that reaches very few households, and how do you expand it and get to more households, right? So you take an inherently nutritious, organic, B Corp, a really responsible business, and how do you scale that? How do you make sure that you're having positive impacts in your communities? I would say if community was like a big focus for ours, but then also environment. And then how do you do it also in a business friendly way? How do you grow top line? How do you get yourself to profitability, and all the while doing right in communities and environment? So I really enjoyed that time. I was there pre-acquisition and stayed through post-acquisition. I was there for about 5 years.
Who acquired them?
Campbell's Soup Company.
Okay.
And then I came to Harmless Harvest. And I have to say, many people ask me, like, so why did you go to Harmless Harvest? Like, what was it about it? And there were 3 things that really struck me about Harmless Harvest. One is fundamentally, it was a responsible business. I believe that business can be a force for good. I do believe that you can grow top line, you can make a business profitable, all the while serving in a very positive and constructive way communities and environment. Mm-hmm. So that first and foremost is a foundational element for me, and certainly Harmless Harvest lives up to that. The second was it's a product that I loved, right? I already knew the product. I already drank Harmless Harvest. And it is, anybody who works in, frankly, any kind of business, but certainly, is CPG, you really want a meaningful point of difference. If you've got a really good product with a meaningful point of difference, and you've got some, IP or some sort of insulation, that's really powerful. And, we buy a very unique coconut that is only located in one part of the world. And we believe it to be the best coconut in the world. And we do a proprietary process where we don't have to thermally cook our coconut water. We do this proprietary filtration process. So you get this very fresh tasting, really, as close to the coconut as you possibly can come experience from it. And so that was really powerful. And then finally, it was a business that had struggled and was not in the best position. But as I assessed the business, I felt the things that I bring to the table, because we all have strengths and opportunity areas, but the things that I brought to the table and the type of talent that I felt that I could build around me, I felt that, I and the team would be up to the task to really, unlocking the potential.
Speaking about both from the General Mills, time and then your time with Plum, it seems like it's almost trying to create a hybrid of those two sort of identities where General Mills had this sort of global reach. And I mean, like you said, 30% of American households, like this massive, massive scale, but also maybe not sort of as clean as Plum sort of products were, right? And it's sort of this, like you said, we think it's sort of possible, right, to kind of have this CPG that's really high quality for us and sort of our body and what we intake into it, and also as maybe a thriving business. But there's so many things that go into this, right? Even on the ground, people actually cutting the coconuts down, right, or picking them up as they fall down from the tree, right? It's like how do we deal with the social responsibility there from the ground level up to on the shelf, and then afterlife, right? When somebody drinks coconut water, they're going to throw the bottle away, right? There's so many dynamics and that's just one product, right? Yeah. Let alone, 10, 15, 30 product lines under a brand. I guess so. When you look at Harmless Harvest and people ask you sort of what it is, right? CPG is such a competitive market. How do you explain it, to a person that, it was like, hey, it's just coconut water, right? It's like, how do you separate yourself from the market? Like, what would you pitch as sort of the mission and sort of vision? Because it is much more than that, right?
Great question. So a couple little things I'll point on. The first, we would encourage people to recycle, not to throw away that bottle.
Yeah.
And I think I would just, also just, in all forms of CPG, I think sometimes, listen, I'm an optimist and I tend to see the bright side of everything. I recognize there are, challenges and whatnot, but even in big companies, we have to recognize, some products and just how you process and what you do in the beginning, it is so expensive and it just is not achievable for so many households. And so I think everybody has a responsibility. So, I think sometimes we demonize, we as a society demonize big CPG, but, they serve they can have the biggest impact. And even, minor incremental shifts have monumental impacts. And so I would certainly encourage everybody in big and small, we can all have a positive impact, and just, subtle changes in formulations and in how they source and stuff like that has a massive impact, as well as then small companies who are taking it the right way from the start, but then like expanding that, whatever. So I think both parties play a role. As far as Harmless Harvest, you're right. It starts in the beginning. And I think, we've certainly done our assessment starting in the farms all the way through end of life cycle. So we have committed to a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas by 2025, which when I made that announcement, I did not have the approval of my team. And, part of it is putting a stake in the ground and challenging us as an organization to get there. And we do an annual mission report, and we are very transparent in how we're tracking on everything that we are doing. And so, there were other commitments I made, moving to 100% recycled plastic for all our beverages, which we've already achieved, as well as, transitioning to regenerative organic, which will be 50% regenerative by the end of this year. So, we're making good on a lot of them. The greenhouse gas, I think we're going to get there. I think we could, there's a chance we're short and there's a chance we far exceed. And what I mean by that is I have 28 agronomists who work directly with farmers on farming practices and regenerative organic. So we're first and foremost, years ago, just on organic, but we've been now for the last 4.5 years working on regenerative organic.
Yeah.
And so we work, some companies, most companies, frankly, their procurement, how they're sourcing all their stuff is all through big companies or whatever it may be. They're very detached from the actual agriculture. And that's one thing that's very different about Harmless Harvest is we have a good relationship with farmers, and we have big landowners as well as really small landowners. And we work with all of them on the principles of regenerative organic. We actually have a separate team that is just enforcing, like does audits and enforcing compliance. So that there's a separate team that reports to a separate person in our Thai operations. And they're all about going through and doing surprise audits, and every farm is audited, right? We just every year, unfortunately, we disqualify a few farms. Thankfully, it's less and less with each year. Mm-hmm. So if our left side, the side that's working on teaching and whatnot is doing a really good job, and we're providing really inexpensive, high quality compost because we're making compost from our husks, we're doing a good job. So it starts really in the farms, and it's a very hands-on approach, which is, I think, very different from most, not all. There are definitely other brands out there that do this type of work as well, but very different than most brands that you see out there. And when we did our audit, our greenhouse, just to understand what our carbon output is, there was one there were actually two surprising findings in there for me. One was 2/3 of our emissions come from two things. And one of them shocked me. One is in the farms, the foliage from the trees falling and then falling into the canals and then decomposing in the canals and emitting methane. Now, that makes sense, but it just had not really crossed our minds that a natural part, a part of nature was actually contributing to greenhouse gas. And so there are ways to take that foliage and incorporate it into our composting activities on the farms. And so, there are great ways for us to address that. But that was one that was, maybe some people would have foreseen it, but yes, I have a fair, I'm familiar with farms in a number of different settings, not in a tropical setting, so to speak, but for me,
in a Wisconsin setting.
Yeah, Wisconsin, that very tropical,
the tropical oasis of Wisconsin.
Exactly. That was pretty surprising to me. That's about 1/3 of our total emissions. Wow. And then another third was, and this one I anticipated, is not using the full coconut, like the husk, and and taking husks to the landfill. And when I took over the company 4.5 years ago, one of the things, I assessed the company, laid out, there are 5 priorities, but they're really just 2 that are most important. If we do those 2 really well, we will be very successful as a business. One was, radically streamlining our supply chain, and with that, getting to zero waste, meaning we have to use that entire coconut. We buy the most expensive coconut in the world. So financially for a business that's losing a lot of money, we need to find a way to use that entire coconut. So scoop the meat and make products with that. And then B, how do we use this husk, right? Because we're paying to transport and paying for disposal in the landfill for these coconut husks, and 40 million coconut husks at that time. Now fast forward today, over 100 million. And then from an innovation standpoint is, all right, right now we're 99.5% of our sales are just plain coconut water in 3-4 sizes. We need to find a way to use this entire coconut and build soda as this business. So, fast forward to today, we scoop the coconut meat, and we use that freshly scooped coconut meat. We puree it, add a little water, tapioca starch, cultures, and voila, there's yogurt. There's our spoonable yogurt. We mix it with coconut water and a few other things and culture it, and there's our drinkable probiotic yogurt. So we do a smoothie, we do a coconut with water with pulp. We do all sorts of items now, starting to really use that entire coconut, as well as the husk. Okay, so the husk is tough,
yeah, right? I've talked to some people about this and doing some really, really cool things. And doing this.
There are really cool things. I will have to admit, we're really good at making very good tasting food and beverage. We're not the best at figuring out how to make furniture and mattresses and biofuel and all sorts of stuff like that.
The easiest one is pallet. I don't know if you know Cocoa Pallet, but they're just using the husk to make pallets. So you can ship your coconut water on coconut pallets, and then.
So what's interesting is, as I've gotten deeper into this, there are a lot of nuances to all the different types of coconuts. So we harvest a young coconut
Right.
that has high water activity. So it doesn't lend itself to some things very well.
Gotcha.
But it has a good amount of lignans, which, I didn't even know what lignans were, which is, kind of like good binding properties if you need to make furniture and things like that. The issue is like, you got to find, it's still a very big item. You got to chop it up. You got to find ways, and then you have to transport it someplace. And somebody's got to have infrastructure and equipment to actually use that output. So it is, in theory, easy. Or seems straightforward. In practice, not as easy. But the good news is we feel over the next 2 years, we'll be at about 95% usage of all of the husks. And we use it in a number of ways. So one, composting is an obvious one for us. So we chop it up, that with then the foliage from the farms, plus then, it's amazing. It's really hard to find organic chicken manure. That just is not much of a thing. At one point, we thought we were going to have to start a chicken farm just for the crap. I mean, who starts a chicken farm just for the crap? Anyway, I won't go down that rabbit hole, but we've figured out a way. But we're making compost. We do some biofuel, which I think is good. It's better than nothing, but it's not my favorite use. So it just replaces petroleum-based, inputs to power a lot of the factories in the area. So it's good, but it's not perfect. We're working on, so we are doing some what we call fibers, where you extract all the fiber out of it, and that can be used in mattresses and things like that. So we've got a partner we're working with on that. And then the one that we're really trying to solve and we really want to do is biochar. So biochar is, you basically burn it in a no oxygen kind of environment. It's a slow burn. And what it does is we can fuel then the factory, right, and be self-generating. And what's left is like, 60, 70, 75% carbon that then gets used on the farms and sequestered in the soil, which is really good for good bacteria growth, right, water absorption. It's like really good for the farm.
This is the regenerative process, right? This is how you figure it out.
Fits into the regenerative. So that's one we're working on. I am particularly focused on that. I do think that would be a great one. If anybody has, great leads in Thailand, just outside of Bangkok, I'm just Ben at harmlessharvest.com. So feel free to reach out. That one, and there are a number of different usages. We make some surfboards. There's all sorts of stuff that it's used for. But, when you're processing 100 million coconuts, you need a lot of ways to use that coconut material. But we're getting there. We're not all the way there, but that's why it gives us something to wake up for every day. We still have a lot of work to do.
You mentioned that you work with a ton of farms, large and small, and some you might have to let go, so to speak. Because I guess I want to touch on that real quick for a second. Is that just because their practices are not up to par? Like they haven't want to sort of change their approach at all? And I think a lot of, I spoke with somebody else in the fashion industry, about sort of manufacturing. And it's like, hey, all these certificates and regenerative stuff. It's like, well, who splits the bill, right? For them to go to totally restructure and innovate, clean their manufacturing process, because that's a lot for a small business to take on, right? It's like, I have to totally recreate how we make stuff for the last 50 years because, the market says we need to be climate friendly, more sustainable, which is fine, but that costs money and they might not be able to afford that. Is that it? Do you see that with farms? Like, do farmers, is it a burden for them to kind of figure out a way to be completely regenerative, like on their own, right? Or do you kind of help them through the process of making this transition? Are there other NGOs that help? Like trying to figure out from their point of view how they're dealing with sort of this transition.
It's a great question. Actually, there are a bunch of little questions in there, so I'll try to address all.
I know I do that.
No. It's actually great. So if I miss one of them, then re-ask it. So one of the things, as far as how we identify, the team has all sorts of little tells. There are little signs that they may have used some sort of fertilizer that's not allowed or whatever, and they can tell just on the farm and through sampling and stuff like that. There are a number of ways for them to tell. So there is that process. We do work with them then. So I would say just overall, I'll state one thing at the very top. So from a regenerative standpoint, our transition to regenerative, part of our goals, a stated goal, is to raise farmers' incomes by at least 10%. So that is part of our objectives. Yeah. And we're training not only, what's interesting, and sometimes this, I will admit, sometimes just the competitive side of me like kind of gets me a little bit, but we are training all farmers, even farmers who are not supplying to us and supplying to competitors. And it's the right thing to do, but it definitely, when you're footing the bill and, and all the resources, from a competitive standpoint, there's always a part of it.
Sure.
Well, can we just do ours first and then?
That's fair.
But the thing is, at the end of the day, we as a brand, I think every brand has basic covenants with their consumers, and we as a brand, our covenant with our consumer is, obviously to deliver a great product, but to do it in the utmost responsible way. And, and that means doing right by communities, doing right by the environment, regardless if it's purely in our self-interest or in others. At the end of the day, we're all, inhabitants of Earth. And so we do that. To your question, in the short term, yes, it is a little harder for farmers. And honestly, a lot of the farmers, and when you think about it, this is just true the world over, you think, and I know it just from growing up, like your first priority in a family is to like put food on the table, have a roof over your heads, clean water, hopefully education for the kids and those types of things. And so it is really basic. And so this whole notion of climate change and long-term and whatever, like, you know what? They're living day to day.
Exactly. It's just not on their radar.
It's just not on their radar. So that is part of the reality. And that is part of the, like we are spending millions to facilitate this transition. So we have incentives in place as well, providing like, the compost is like super cheap. So it costs us money to be making and delivering compost. We're building up this capability all along the farms. And, so it is an investment, and we started with pilot farms. You get that experience, and they have had a very good experience, and they're seeing already after a couple of years, positive impacts, right? And then we use them to help train more farmers, and then we get them going. And as they see good experiences, then they train in others. And so we have incentives in place. We work really hard with them. We provide lots of, we're providing the ground cover for free, the nitrogen fixing ground cover. We're doing those types of things as much as we possibly can to really help. We're also, honestly, there are, from a government standpoint in Thailand, there are crops, whether it be rice or different types that, they have a strong focus on. And because we've been growing, and we did have a session with them a year ago with the agricultural minister, and he was really proud and really impressed with just how much we were doing in the communities and how much, we're really bringing the Nam home, their coconut that they're so proud of to the US and other parts of the world. And, part of that is also we want farmers, those farmers, not just rice and all the others, we want, farmers of Nam home to really start having a voice, making sure that, as they're thinking about their agricultural practices, that, they have the right, regulations, the right support, the right types of incentives in place to support them. It's certainly in their best interest. It's in our best interest. So it's trying to work at it from all angles, both on the ground with farmers, actively helping them, teaching them, financially incentivizing, financially subsidizing some of these transitions, as well as then, are there things from a government, from a, whatever standpoint that, certainly serves not only other types of farmers, but, the Nam-hum farmers.
Two more questions here. One would be, we had talked before we came on a little bit about, plastic and kind of where we are in the world, its emotional relationship with plastic, specifically, I think with single use, right? We kind of all, do it in some way. It's really hard to get away from it. And there's all kind of materials. There's a lot of innovation, around trying to figure out a way to, whether it's replace plastic at large scale or figure out some type of just much more sustainable way to do plastic at scale, specifically just at single use. The ironic thing is that plastic is like one of the most sustainable materials ever made. The problem is when it starts to be used as a commodity, the problem is it is so sustainable that it doesn't really break down. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's the problem. And I respected that you kind of wrote about this and you looked at it from a lens of like, hey, this is where we are. We're trying to figure it out. There's a long way to go, but we're taking steps. So I just from your, research in this area and the things that you guys have tried to implement or are implementing, what's your sort of overview on where we are with, single-use plastics and how we're getting better at it?
So I would say, there are two things. I think sometimes we overly simplify it into just one thing, and we see whether something's recycled or thrown away as like the kind of, how good or bad it is from a climate change and all that type of stuff. And it really is not that simple. I would break it, if I were to simplify it, I'd break it into two things. There's one is what drives climate impact. So when you think about the energy and the resources to fabricate whatever kind of, whether it be aluminum, or glass, cardboard, Tetra Pak, plastic, whatever it may be, what it costs to, distribute in logistics, right? So you're using resources there, like everything, as well as then to recycle and whatnot. There's that component, which has, a carbon impact. And then the second thing is, it's really a waste issue, right? So what is the end of life cycle for that item?
Right.
Can it be recycled or not? And those are two very distinct but important things. When it comes to, from a climate impact, from a carbon standpoint, I've read all sorts of studies. I've talked to all sorts of experts. Plastic is the best. Honestly, I went into it thinking I do not want to do a petroleum-based plastic. I don't, let's do something different. And I can't ignore the science on this. And at first, when I didn't hear what I wanted to hear, then, you go find other sources or whatever. And the people who, really know what they're talking about and want to find good changes, begrudgingly all admit that plastic is still the bbest. Now, there are plant-based plastics. And so from a fabrication standpoint, you could make some arguments. There's what are crops used to grow? And then, there is some discussion there. But all in all, bioplastic is actually pretty good in that regard. And so that really then became, we should do, a plant-based plastic. The issue then, now let's start talking about end of life, right? So if you think, back in the day, aluminum and glass and stuff like that, were not really recycled, and then there were incentives put in place, and then you drove up recycling rates. Right? Plastic has not had that yet, and plastic is not recycled nearly at the same rates as aluminum and glass and things like that. Part of our thinking is, if we are paying more for recycled plastic, we are starting to create economic incentive for now municipalities to have the infrastructure to recycle, because they can make more money on this recycled plastic. So, it costs us millions more per year to use recycled plastic than regular virgin plastic. And so we did transition to 100% recycled plastic. And that certainly then starts to create this cycle where you eliminate, because our issue with plastic is it's not recycled at the same rates, and then it's used for so many different things. So bottles, like a PET bottle, those things are pretty easily recycled. It's a matter of creating economic value for those to be recycled. Yeah. More flexible film type things, so pouches, bags, and stuff like that, those are harder. In fact, they're not readily recyclable. Those are, certainly, bigger issues, and certainly finding a way to make sure that you can recycle those. I want to touch on one thing just on this plant-based, biodegradable plastic. That, for a while there was, I was like, okay, we got to figure out we're going to do that. As I talk to experts, especially, as you start looking at the municipalities and how they recycle, the issue with those is consumers, you can't really tell the difference between a bioplastic plant-based versus a regular PET.
And one can be, they have to be recycled separately, or one can be and one can't be?
So the plant-based cannot be recycled. And what happens is it ends up in the recycling stream, and it's not easily discernible. In fact, I get it wrong. You know what I mean? If I look at it, I can't tell the difference. You can't really tell the difference. So the problem is it goes into that recycling stream, and it pollutes the recycling stream, and then you can't recycle any of that plastic. Wow. And so it creates actually a bigger problem. And so it really was deflating to me. I have to be very honest.
Yeah, for sure.
Seriously, I can't do a compostable bottle made out of plant material because it's going to really muck things up. And oh, by the way, less than 1% of municipalities can actually compost that anyway. So it just, Unfortunately, we live in a very imperfect world. And, at the end of the day, you can't let that paralyze you. And you got to put one foot in front of the other and start doing better. And so what we decided immediately was, you know what? We're going to get to 100% rPET. So we're not going to use any more virgin plastic. We are going to pay extra to get this recycled pellets so we can blow new bottles and then, constantly recycle plastic. So you create economic value. You address then the one major issue with plastic, which is waste. Right? Making sure that we're pulling plastic, that diverting it away from the waterways, the landfills, or wherever it might be, creating economic value for municipalities to start recycling. So we feel it's a responsible path, but we are not done. Like, we continue to explore all sorts of ways to find new packaging. And, my team would, they don't like when I share these ideas and examples and stuff like that because they're so not commercially viable yet.
Right.
But that does not stop me from wanting to and pursuing and trying to figure out a way. So a good example, the husk potentially can be used to make corrugate. So what I'd love to do is, we already use recycled inputs for the corrugate, but what if, those husks, in addition to doing biochar and whatnot, we started, packaging our bottles and stuff in a cardboard that's made out of the coconut husk,
Right.
and, in transport. So, there are ideas like that. We're looking at, that you can form bottles out of, more kind of plant materials that are really readily decompostable. That could potentially be used. We're looking at that. It's still a little ways away. Our issue, which most people don't know or may not realize, is we harvest we buy year round our coconuts. But most of the supply is in the fall. Most others in the market actually stop buying because it becomes incredibly expensive to buy from farmers. Starting actually right now, we're paying a lot for coconuts right now, and we're buying still a lot because we have our forecast warrants it. But others will not buy, and they will only buy when coconuts are cheap. So one of the benefits we provide to farmers that they love is we buy year round. So even when it's really expensive, we're there to buy their really expensive coconuts, because at the end of the day, the trees don't stop providing coconuts, and they need a market. They have to make a living year round. And so we buy year round, but coconuts become very plentiful and much cheaper in the fall. So we do bottle the vast majority of our supply in the fall. What that means with our proprietary process, we can freeze our product and it basically locks in the shelf life, locks in the quality. And so we have to be able to freeze and thaw. And so technically speaking, when you start thinking about a vessel that needs to be able to freeze and thaw, first of all, you can't entertain that in glass. And aluminum, you have issues as well. So no matter what we're thinking of as far as a vessel to put our coconut water in, we do have to think about the practicalities of those things as well. There are technical, both in a processing standpoint, as well as then when you think about how you distribute and store and things like that, that you have to think of. So everybody's learning a little bit more about how we do coconut water here.
Yeah. I want to touch on, you said incentives, and I think that is a great word. Whether it's local municipalities, how do we incentivize to invest, or even local small businesses, right? Or innovators, entrepreneurs, how do you invest in, these facilities where, people just won't do it or say, because, that stuff doesn't get recycled. They read an article and it's, that's it. They'll never look into it again. So they'll never recycle. So part of it is that I think the incentives need to be somehow from the consumer side. Like, how do we incentivize at scale consumers to take time out of their day, change the way they do things, and simply, recycle, right? Is there monetarily is the biggest thing, right? Maybe if you figure out a way where, like growing up, it was 5 cents for aluminum can, right?
Yeah.
And obviously inflation and there's things that doesn't do much, but if it's, if we could bump it up to like 10 cents, or there's a way to get it to tax deduction, or some way, if you can, there's sort of a recycling. There has to be a way, to me, from a consumer point of view, from an economic point of view, to get 300 million people to really seriously think about like going out of their way to recycle, and then that will create that end of life economy where facilities will come, municipalities invest, because then they'll have everybody doing this. Then it gives them a reason to really invest. So I think the incentive is a great word, and I think it just needs incentivize on all the different sides of the supply chain.
Yeah, I'd add to that. So I think there are two things to have. And the second thing is kind of a two-prong. So the first thing is, I do think as a country, we need to standardize how we recycle, like how we sort our garbage. That is, I mean, you can move from like a mile away to a different town.
Yeah, right. Totally.
And they recycle differently.
Yeah.
And then, you may even have recycling, and then you see them dumping the recycled stuff into the garbage or something like, there's like stuff happens, right? So we need to, as a country, we need to, from the top down, standardize how we recycle, because then that starts eliminating confusion, because it is very confusing. And I know lots of smart people, and I am a pretty smart person. And there are times I'm like, oh no, that can be recyclable. And like, here it's not, there it is. It's just different everywhere. So standardized recycling, number one. Number two is, I agree with you, incentives, right? So go back to like what worked, with aluminum cans or whatever. It's like, all right, 5 cents, 10 cents, whatever the number is, start paying for all plastic bottles and anything that can be recycled to begin with. And I would also, as a government, I would provide incentives if municipalities invest in these, the ability to recycle, that you provide incentives, like tax breaks, whatever it may be, to make that investment, because they have to look at the economics as well. So they have to look at like, okay, it's going to cost me $25 million to invest. I can, then sell these, this recycled plastic pellets for X amount. And they have at the end of the day, they have to look at the financials as well. So that's where government can help and jumpstart and facilitate something happening. Standardize, incentivize, both for municipalities to start recycling, as well as then consumers to start recycling these bottles.
I feel like these are very reasonable things. Yeah. And that can be, we subsidize, it's just smartly subsidizing certain areas. We did it with EVs, we're doing it with EVs.
Solar. There's so many.
Exactly. So like there's these smart ways to use subsidies as a powerful force to grow these certain economies, create jobs. Like standardizing to me is like such a great point, and such a, I think, nothing's easy, right? But it simplifies it for everybody involved. And when you have criteria, everybody can follow it. It just simplifies things more. So I think that's a great point. Last question I'll end here was a little bit on the future. And I know we talked a lot about some of the future things and some of the things that you guys are working on, but I guess just from a goal standpoint and what does success look like for you in 3 to 5 years? What would you like to see, sort of happen?
Success for Harmless. And I believe we're on the path. It's not an easy path, I will have to admit. And frankly, everybody who's out there who's, working in these types of, or any kind of business, right? I think sometimes it can feel a little paralyzing because the mountain is high that, we're climbing. But, I feel confident in our path. And I think one is the brass tacks is we have to have a successful business, meaning growing sales and generating some profits for us to really invest in the things that drive impact in communities and environments. So one does not exist with the other, right? So it can't be pure mission, because if you don't make money, then at the end of the day, the investors, it just all dries up, right? So you got to deliver the business, but I do believe you can deliver the business in a very responsible way. And I also believe we can't be successful unless we are responsible. A, it's in our name, but B, I just feel like business can have the most immediate and biggest impact, far more than most nonprofits and government. So, we are on the forefront, and I think we can do a lot because consumers will vote with their paycheck and make decisions increasingly in a responsible way. And the younger generations are doing it far more than, we all say that it's important. And then there's always a gap between those who do and versus say, and that gap has closed considerably, especially for the younger generations. So if I could fast forward, 3 to 5 years, for me, we have a range of products that are really using that entire coconut. I want all, our goal, we believe, will be at 75% of our coconuts scooped by the end of the year. And it's a very manual process. But being able to use that entire coconut, husk included, and that we think we can get to climate positive. We've got a lot of work to do. It requires biochar. It requires using all that husk. It requires us recycling the foliage. Interestingly, the actual shipping of all the bottles and stuff like that over to the U.S. is a tiny part of the overall impact. It's actually probably number 16 on the list, which I think that was a little surprising to me. I thought it would be higher, but I hadn't thought through how efficient these container ships really are compared to like a semi truck driving across the U.S. As an example. But I think being so climate positive, using that entire coconut, and really farms being really biodiverse and regenerative, farmers making more money, happy. That is where I want to take this business. And we honestly, like, we're working hard to, we're a pretty expensive product, and we've worked tirelessly to make this business profitable without taking price advances. And so that is my goal. Like, I want to continue to democratize and keep offsetting inflation with just getting more and more efficient, but also doing right by environment and communities. And so more and more people can enjoy our products. So going back to that earlier what I said about, like, working at a General Mills where you're, if you're working on Progresso soup, you're reaching 25% of households. How do you make that better and better each year? That's great. That's a positive for consumers and for the world if they're making steps, because they have such a profound impact even with incremental changes. Whereas if I can take household penetration from 1 to 3 to 5 to 10 to 15 and we're climate positive, that is positive, right? That is, we're driving positive impact and making real change and delivering simple, nutritious, great products that consumers love. And the more we can do to keep it economically viable for people, then I think that's a win-win.
Amazing, Ben. Thank you for taking the time. I know you're busy. I always appreciate, people taking time out their schedule to come on and talk about and be honest with a bunch of things that they're working on and what their vision for what they're building is. So really appreciate you taking the time, and best of luck for the next decade for you and your team.